Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Gladen, director of the Blackstone LaunchPad. We've been hosting a number of these indoor innovator interview series. But today, in a way, I guess we're going to talk about what might we do if we at some point get the chance to go back outdoors. So what might the new normal, whatever that is, look like, and how can we prepare for it? So that's what we're hoping to chat a little bit. I've got two awesome guests, a couple of my favorite people, creative thinkers, stimulating thinkers. So, and I'll let them introduce themselves briefly momentarily. Sid, at least on the right as I look at it, with the giant 80-20 show. Maybe you can tell us what the 80-20 show is in a moment. Sid is a awesome local champion of small business, I would say, and been involved in a bunch of stuff, 1 Million Cups, Missoula. I know at least at one point, Sid, I don't know if you still are, board chair at MCT as well. So yes. A real great contributor to our community. And then, at least on my left, Mike Braun, one of my colleagues at UM, strategy professor at the College of Business, as well as doing a whole bunch of business stuff himself. So I guess I've sort of introduced you both there, but anyway, I'll let you both tell the listeners what else you want to tell them about yourself. So do you want to give us a quick intro, and then we'll jump into the meat of the conversation?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. One thing I want to say, not only are you and Mike a couple of my favorite people, Michael Braun, I've always enjoyed and admired, until one day I dropped by your office, Mike, and you had a box of cookies that were in the shape of your head and your face. And you're like, here, you want a cookie? And it was like, it's a mini Michael Braun. I'm like, what is this? And it was very awkward to eat that cookie looking at you. But since then, I was like, what a brilliant idea. I've sent those to other business owners and friends, people, as a thank you gift, a box of cookies in the shape of their own head. So that has zero to do with what we're talking about today, but other than innovation, I guess. So my quick backstory is just that I own a couple of small businesses here in Missoula. They're both service businesses. We've been at it for 16, 17 years. And Paul, you mentioned champion of small business. I have a big passion for small business. And so that's where my involvement with the 1 Million Cups and things like this, Innovate has come from. And you mentioned the 80-20 show. I do an industry podcast called the 80-20 show, where it's the 80-20 service business. And it's for small businesses who, typically small business owners, just work too damn hard. They're trying to do everything themselves, and we try to help them apply the 80-20 rule to get more results with less effort. So that's what that's about.
All right. I like it. Mike.
That's awesome, Sid. I can't wait to actually listen to the show. So, my name is Mike Braun. I'm at the College of Business. I've been there for 13 years. Prior to that, I spent a decade in business, first with business development, sales, also with startups and small businesses, and then as an investment banker. And some of the things that I'm doing now are not just sort of theoretical. I also started an import business recently, and it seems to be one of the shortest living ventures right now. But I hope to be back on it when we actually do get to that new normal, Paul. So thank you.
Awesome. So Sid, I know our focus predominantly today is on sort of thinking about the future, but I'm just curious, you maybe give us just a minute or two on, as you said, you've got a couple of local services businesses. How have you sort of weathered this environment to date? What impact has it had? How have you sort of adapted, responded just locally?
Yeah. One thing, so we have two service businesses. One's a window cleaning company. One is an auto detail company. The window cleaning company we're classified as janitorial. So that makes us a necessary worker.
Essential service.
Essential service. Yeah. But we did, the first week of the stay home order, we went ahead and closed down to spend time regrouping the troops and seeing how can we adapt, how can we provide more value in the area. One thing we did was we immediately acquired the equipment that we can use for large scale outdoor disinfecting. So and the purpose of that was we wanted to see if we could disinfect all of the Missoula County public school playgrounds and all of the city playgrounds and anything, even state parks and rest areas and things like that. So we're on speed dial for that. None of that has happened yet, but that was a quick adaptation to make sure that we were really staying within the framework of essential and providing, a valuable service in the current scenario. But the main thing for myself and a lot of my business friends and colleagues is just maintaining a very nimble attitude and going,
Right.
things, the rug just got pulled out from under you. So don't lie down on the ground, just get up and figure out what can you do.
Yep.
We started this with a team exercise at our company by Zoom. A lot of people were concerned, were negative, were fearful, whatever. And we said, take a notepad, and at the top of your notepad, write the line, right now is a great time to, and leave it blank. And then how many things can fill up a page.
Yep.
Now's a great time to, even if it's binge watching Netflix, but it could be learning a new skill, practice piano, train your dog. There's a million things you could be doing to provide value and benefit. Sorry, there's long-winded.
No, that's great. I love that positive thinking. And I've always, I think the characteristic I love most in entrepreneurs is resilience, because you do get punched in the face, right? A bunch of times, whether it's through something like COVID-19 or just other things as an entrepreneur, and you just have to get up and okay, how do we learn from that? How do we adapt? And adjust? So cool. Mike, one of the reasons we were keen to have you part of this conversation, I know you've actually spent time sort of researching sort of prior recessions, and wonder if you might share a little bit of what have we learned from those previous kind of recessions?
Well, listen, that's one benefit of getting old, right? I mean, things are starting to hurt everywhere, but we do have wisdom, and we have experiences, whether it's the savings and loan crisis that led to the late 80s and early 90s recession, or then obviously the dot-com bust and 9/11, and then obviously the Great Recession. Sure, they all had sort of a different reason for their emergence, but recessions in and of themselves have very common characteristics. And it's something that my colleague and I started researching, really because we had gone through those. I mean, I'd gotten busted out during the recession in 2001. So did he, and that was one of the drivers that actually made us get into academia. But then we sort of wanted to forensically go back and try to understand what the hell happened. And one of the things is that up until recently, there was sort of this common thinking that recessions really can't be fought; they can only be tolerated. And sure, then there was a little bit more of looking at operationally what businesses could do, obviously sort of cash flow management, building up their slack. But more recently, there's been more of a shift of focusing on consumer behaviors, right? So what actually happens during and after recession when it comes to consumer behaviors? And I think that's where things get super interesting, because basically when you think about consumers, best case scenario, they'll come back to your business, but worst case scenario, they're gone forever, right? Mm-hmm. So you want to try to understand a little bit about, what those consumer behavioral shifts are going to be and how you can try to anticipate those and try to position yourselves. And just as a quick example, and then I'll give it back to you, but just think about sort of as an example in the last recession, how quickly landlines and cable television sort of, got put to the side, right? So the Great Recession obviously impacted consumers and consumer households, and they said, well, here are some things that we don't necessarily need to do with anymore. We're going to cut cores on landlines and cable television, and we'll rely on our cell phones and Netflix instead, right? So that's just one example.
Love it. Sid, I know you talk to a bunch of other entrepreneurs, folks that think like you across the country. What are you sort of seeing and hearing in terms of how folks are thinking about this?
Yeah, so there always be, when chaos happens, a lot of people shrink in fear. Mm-hmm. They're just like, oh my God, we're just gonna, batten down the hatches until the storm is gone. But then there's always storm chasers that want to go outside where the tornado is and watch it and be a part of it, because it is more exciting. But what I'm finding with the people that are really maximizing what's going on right now is they're out in the storm and they're looking for opportunities, and they don't mind stumbling and falling. I've got a friend that in January invested in a distillery in Nashville, Tennessee, and had been losing money for 3 years since it was founded. And he and a partner invested about 20% of it and said, we're going to do a turnaround. Well, that's what he does normally. But then COVID happened and they're like, make hand sanitizer. But then they used their contacts and they got a government contract for, I think it was $45 a gallon or something. So they will net in the first quarter of COVID, $1.5 million. And Mike is his name. And I was like, Mike, you're really smart. And he said, sometimes you're smart, sometimes you're just lucky. It's like, you couldn't have planned for a COVID crisis where hand sanitizer is out everywhere, but they could adapt to it. Similar story, restaurants and gyms are closed down everywhere. But restaurants quickly pivoted and said, hey, we'll do curbside pickup. You just order online, pay online, and we'll sit the bag out on the table. That's great. And an acquaintance of mine in California with his restaurant, their revenue is actually doubled during the crisis. And here's why. They immediately went into the toilet. They were down to like 90%. They were doing curbside, and he just messaged all of his customers and was like, hey, you're coming by to pick up a meal. We will prepare 5 meals in freezer ready packages, and you can pick up meals for the whole week. Mm-hmm. So he turned weekly customers into daily customers with one stop, and his restaurant revenue went up, but his staff is down. So he's actually prospering during this time, but that's not a normal, he probably didn't plan for that ahead of time. That's right. Just adapting to this, making margaritas out of lemons. Is that what you do? Lemonade. Close. It's citrus.
It'll work. Yeah. I think what's sort of interesting about that, and it goes back to your comment, Mike, about sort of consumer behaviors. And on the LaunchPad, it's one of the things I talk about the most. Peter Drucker's quote, the purpose of business is to create a customer. So you've got to ask, what do customers actually want? So how do we engage kind of with customers about how this new normal changes what they need?
Right. And right now, Paul, I think Sid's given some great examples of sort of immediate needs, right? And especially during this time of ambiguity. But we are going to shift to uncertainty, meaning that, ambiguity, everything's upside down. We don't know when this thing is going to end and the full impact. But then we're going to get sort of back into this uncertainty, and then there's going to be this new normal, right? And at that point, what you're going to see is, we probably are going to be in a recession. And at that point, as those demand shocks really take hold, you're going to have sort of 3 consumer reactions. You're going to have consumers that either get by with less, they're going to stop consuming in certain categories altogether, or then they're going to seek out alternatives. And by alternatives, It's not just sort of, downgrading from, organic milk to regular milk, but also looking at other products and services that satisfy similar needs, right?
Yep.
So, and when you start getting that, it gets super interesting, because what you're going to see is customers making trade-offs between price and performance, sort of value and the price that they pay, right? And at that point, you're going to see new players or existing companies who kind of, adapt to that new environment, really leaning into that demand curve, coming up with compelling value propositions that now feed into the demand of that new environment.
Right. Yep.
And I think that's where people want to focus. It's really like, okay, can I sort of anticipate a little bit what is going to get prioritized by consumers, whether it's in my industry or in sort of adjacent industries where I might be able to migrate into?
Like, as I sort of think through this, one of the things that's sort of gone through my mind a little bit is we obviously see people at not necessarily extremes. We've seen people that have sort of been extremely impacted in terms of unemployment, or their businesses, their kind of revenue has evaporated. But there is at least a segment, at least you or I are sort of at least in a position where we're fortunate we have, at least currently, we have jobs that we're paid for. And in a way, we don't have anything to spend money on, right? Other than literally ordering kind of delivery food. So how do you, and we will get more of a recession, right? If everyone just hunkers down and says, geez, it's too uncertain, I can't spend. How do businesses think about finding those folks that are in a position and might be willing to kind of spend money?
No, it's interesting. I think one of the things, and I just had this conversation with somebody yesterday, it's, some of these businesses might now start getting inquiries from either existing customers or new customers that seem sort of off the wall, right? Hey, are you guys doing this? Can you do this? And it's like, what? No, right? But actually it's listening to that and saying, and asking, why are you asking that, right? Because then you actually figure out how their, whether it's on the B2B or B2C side, how their behaviors are shifting, and there might be real opportunities in there. So it means that you really want to have your ear to the ground with some of the existing or new customers that might be coming in with some of these strange inquiries.
Mm, I like that. Sid, what are you, I mean, you mentioned what you're sort of thinking of doing just in terms of sort of preparing the kind of desanitized kind of parks and stuff. What are you thinking about in terms of how you're going to engage sort of your customers, or even are you looking at different customers kind of moving forward?
Yes and no. There are two parts to that. One is, during the crisis, one of the things that we did, and it's just a suggestion from my friend that has a significant company in San Francisco. He said everybody was canceling. He does a lot of commercial work, and like everyone's canceling. So he just got on the phone and started calling. He said he made a list of his top 25 and like just called his customers and asked them how they're doing. He didn't ask them for business, didn't ask anything,
Right.
and it eased their tension. And then not they all booked, but he booked $750,000 of business from those calls because he cared. So one thing we're doing is making sure that we keep our communication channels open with our customers, that we're trying not to annoy them, but communicate often enough that they know that with confidence, hey, we're in business and we're just here to help you. And if you need anything, and it could be the oddball question like Mike was talking about, they call up and ask, hey, can you change light bulbs? Or, we have a squirrel that's causing problems. You have a ladder. Right. And listening to those and getting the feedback. The other part of that is, during any recession, and Mike, I'd love to hear more about you guys' kind of analytics of the previous recessions, but like if you got, whatever the market share is I'm just talking from service business perspective, when the market drops, some of the other businesses, they can't afford that drop. If their business goes, cuts in half, they're out of business. They can't support themselves. They quit and go get a job. What happens to the other half of their customer base? Well, it goes somewhere. So my goal and anyone that's like going, hey, now's the time to push the gas pedal a little bit. Let's acquire market share in the downturn. And when it all comes back up, then you're more even better positioned to grow and scale beyond that. So now's, in my opinion, and you asked, what are we doing? We're being as aggressive as we can afford to be in the downturn. And a lot of that is not spending money. It's spending attention and energy and time and doing one-to-one, face-to-face, talking to people.
Right.
Sid, you're dead on. I mean, first of all, we've had recessions every sort of 6 to 7 years since World War II, except this one took a little longer and nobody saw the source of its cause, but at the same time, and Schumpeter, he's a famous Austrian economist, he calls these creative destruction, because what you get is companies and older business models that get destroyed, but they give rise to new creative business models out there. But it's the folks who now think about investing, and to your point, not necessarily money yet, resources, but time and sort of creative thinking on innovations that can then actually position them for competitive advantage once we actually come out of this recession.
Yeah. What I like about this is it's so true to the entrepreneurial method that kind of, Mike, that you and I espouse. And even with a startup, we're always like kind of get out of the Steve Blank lean startup method, get out of the building, go talk to your potential customers, understand what problem you're solving for them. It's the same thing that Sid is espousing. Go talk to customers, find out how you can help them. That'll give you the insights on kind of where the opportunity is.
And I would also say that maybe you go back and sort of look at your resources capabilities, right? And say how you can sort of, reconfigure them for some of these potential new markets out there. I mean, and we've already seen that. I mean, to Sid's point, all of a sudden, the distillers are saying, actually, we're in the alcohol making business, not necessarily, liquor for consumption. But with this, we have resources and capabilities to make hand sanitizer. So, go back to the drawing board and say, well, what else is it that we can do here to repackage this for an emerging customer segment?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a really interesting the indoor interview we did yesterday, or Morgan did yesterday, with Molly Bradford. Many of you may know her platform, MissoulaEvents.net. And Gatherboard, which is providing events calendars kind of for other organizations across the country, even around the world. And what she sort of discovered is, I mean, one, you'd think like, Jesus, an events business, well, that's pretty much gone to the zip, right? But actually people are now starting to list all their online events, and people are streaming stuff.
Yeah.
So now the question we got into a little bit, and kind of Molly is going to follow up, and we're going to have a further conversation around this, is like, well, if some of these events are being streamed and recorded, do you want to start to provide access to that recorded material? I mean, it's never really been a question before, right? Because it was always about these in-person live events. You go to it, the events happened. It's history. But now actually that history is being recorded, and maybe people want to go look at that. Kind of talking about there were a couple of sort of music related events where a whole bunch of different bands were playing. It's like the music's there. You want to go back and watch that. I mean, we're doing that with these sessions. We're recording them, hopefully as a resource that are kind of helpful to businesses. So Molly is now like, oh, geez, how do I reconfigure my platform to potentially enable folks to go access those recorded events? So Mike, to your point, really sort of thinking about what resources, capabilities do we have? How can we reconfigure them? But also maybe what new resources or capabilities do we need to still in many ways serve the same customer base, but the things they're looking for are kind of different.
So there's a little question in the chat box. I'm jumping in from Russ. Is it more important to try and figure out how to sell now or develop more potential customers? And that's been a common call that I've heard or question on other calls from Techstars as well. So I think it's a great question. And he gives an example. You guys can skim that if you want in the chat. But what would your take be?
Sid, you want to take that?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. A lot of that is more in the tech world, or like where you can provide, like a streaming service like this is infinitely scalable. So, a company, if they're already in business or making money, whatever, they can afford to give away a lot just to create goodwill and collect the customer data, so later they can sell to them. And that's a very valuable way to go. If you're a bootstrapper and you don't have cash to give away a service, you have to think both ways. Some of the people in my industry have started doing, they'll give away a loss leader that will just break even, just so they can acquire new customers. So they're trying to acquire the customers as much as possible. So it's a hybrid of like charging full service and getting a new customer and giving it away just to get their contact data, so that they can grow it in the future. So the main thing, and Mike, you probably agree with this, is even though things are tricky or chaotic, is you have to look at playing the long game. It's not just a today game, but you got to survive today. So you can.
Well, yeah, I agree with you. I look at it in terms of customer acquisition and retention, right? So obviously in an up market, you see that businesses are really sort of, let's get more customers in the door. What happens now is that now we've switched our focus. Everybody, first of all, wants to retain their existing customers, right? Just to stabilize the top line and the bottom line. And of course, that's a priority. At the same time, you also want to at least start thinking about and sort of listening to where that next customer acquisition cycle is going to be, right? So, it's a little bit of walking and chewing gum at the same time. But I think it's, to Sid's point, it's those companies that do start to think innovatively and creatively about customer acquisition in that next upswing, who will actually prevail and then succeed.
I think investing in those customer relationships. I mean, we've certainly, through LaunchPad, we chatted with a couple of sort of local health service, sort of healthcare providers. And part of their model right now has just been, if we've got expertise about even it's sort of more mental health or just sort of good nutrition, things like that, that it can be easy to sort of get out of control. I was mentioning before we were starting, I was probably ordering too much pizza. Because I'm kind of, if you could do things that sort of help people provide useful information, useful guidance and advice to people, even if you're not generating revenues around that, you're building a trusting relationship with folks who are potentially going to come back when they're in a position to potentially spend money with you. You're building those relationships. So I agree with both of you. It's sort of, sure, if you can adapt your products and services for stuff that people can afford now, then great, go do that. And obviously, as you said, Sid, you've got to figure out, can you navigate financially through this? But to the extent that maybe you don't have things that people are necessarily going to be in a position to pay for now, if you can navigate your way through, but be a valued, trusted kind of resource to people, then they're going to look to you when they do come through this, and hopefully in a position to start spending money.
People,
go ahead, Sid.
Oh, I was just going to say, people always remember a relationship where they might forget a transaction.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. And I wanted to point out one thing I think that was really valuable that Mike said was where that acquisition cycle may be. And I think the question there is like, is it that businesses are being opportunistic? Is it that they're paying attention to forward trends? Like, are there cues that people can pay attention to a little bit as far as like, when does that pick back up and when do you shift your focus? So that's one. And then I have another question in the chat too.
Do you want to, sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I think, market timing is so difficult, right? Now, I will tell you again from, the economic data has shown that, recessions, the actual recession as it's defined by the NBER, which is the National Bureau of Economic Research, doesn't last that long. It's then more the recovery period, right? And that's where companies tend to struggle. So, I don't know how long this recession will be, but the other thing is we don't necessarily know, what else is going to come out of this recession in terms of a changed landscape. That recovery period is probably going to take a while. And it's during that recovery period where you see consumers obviously shifting. And we know that, recessions are about demand shocks. So obviously they're going to look at changing their purchasing behavior, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's drastic ones. Sometimes these are micro pivots. Let me just give you an example. So in the last recession, obviously consumers were hit pretty hard. And if you were treating yourself to a Starbucks latte at $4, all of a sudden that became a nice to have. But what was interesting is McDonald's came in, they said, you know what? We're going to come out with a Mac Cafe. We're going to come out with something that's kind of similar to a Starbucks sort of, self-indulgence, but we're going to do it at $2. So with a Mac Cafe, they were offering cappuccinos and they were offering something like a Frappuccino just at a lower price point. Sure, it didn't have the brand behind it and everything, but that's how McDonald's was able to come in and actually do a pretty good job of stealing some of Starbucks market share as they were trying to readjust to the new normal.
Yeah, I love sort of thinking about if in different businesses, how would you adapt to this? So on the presumption, right, that and even with the sort of the president setting out yesterday, here are some of the guidelines for how you might start to open things up. We know it's not going to be just sort of flip the switch from kind of what we've got today to like it's kind of free range, anyone can do everything. So if you think about sort of restaurants and bars, do we get to an environment in which kind of do I now make reservations at my favorite bar so I know I can get a table that's kind of got enough space for me and the 2 or 3 people I'm having drinks with, and I can reserve that for a couple of hours to, do I pay for that privilege? Will I go to restaurants that are going to provide me with sort of much more kind of private booth, sort of dining rooms or booths? So it's sort of interesting. And will I pay a premium for that, right? If I'm essentially trying to somewhat social distance, therefore reduce the number of interactions I have with the broader public, and therefore I'm eating out, drinking out less than I would normally, am I willing to pay more for that experience? Because actually now it's much more of a treat rather than just a casual experience.
For that exact scenario, we're starting to make hats that are similar to a giant sombrero, but it's a hat with a hula hoop around it so that anywhere you go, people can't get close to you. You've got built-in space. I don't know how the restaurant owners will like this, but you're going to adapt.
But
we've got another.
And just quickly, Paul, to your point, actually, I don't know if you saw, but 2 days ago, EasyJet said that from now on, they're going to keep the middle seat open for flights going forward.
Okay.
Right? So they're already making adjustments to at least stabilize. And then to your point, who knows if, tomorrow's flight will look like, all of it will look like business or first class, big seats, lots of space. And businesses will say, listen, we know that, a lot of individuals can adjust to having business meetings on Zoom. So this becomes more of a premium that we invest in, right?
Yeah, no, interesting. Morgan, it sounds like you got a question.
Sorry, another question. So how about pricing? So are business owners, should they be discounting their offerings right now? Or should they come up with a creative new delivery method or just sustain?
Yeah, I think, Michael, you touched on that earlier when you talked about value proposition. So it's just creating a value proposition, and that may mean giving a discount because you want to get this thing out the door. But in some cases, it'd be, we're going to raise the price. We're going to raise the price because now we're offering, contactless service. You don't have to worry about, any contagions or anything like that. Restaurants have been doing this. Even on a micro level, a friend of mine works at Hoagieville, and she's making more money than ever because they car hop, and people, it's an $8 order. They hand her a 20 and say, you just keep that, because they don't want to deal with change and things like that. But there's a lot of services or products that enjoy a premium now and probably will for the foreseeable future, because it's going to be more of the new norms. Like, a service worker is going to always wear a mask when they go to your house. I don't know.
Yeah.
But,
I was actually had an email exchange with Bryce Ward, who many people know is a super sharp economist, used to work at lives here in Missoula, because we were trying to figure out a response for a particular kind of group of businesses in town. And essentially we got to the bottom, sort of the economist perspective on this, that there are some businesses that got relatively sort of fixed commitments right now. So to some extent, your pricing can be as low as essentially what creates incremental revenue above any of your incremental costs to serve those customers at this point in time. So if you can be creating some contribution to your fixed costs, that may be what you have to do right now to sort of just help try to kind of pay the bills, even if it's not sustainable in the long run. Yeah. So I think there are, like always, and this was the economist's response to my initial question to him, was like, it depends. So we had to get into a more detailed conversation about what kind of businesses. So some businesses may be cutting prices because that's the best way to just to sort of sustain themselves in the short term. Others might be like you've suggested, Sid, can charge a premium because of kind of the dynamics of their particular discipline.
Yeah. I'll add one more sort of just, thought exercise, if you will. But for me, price is never an issue if the value is there, right? This goes back to the value proposition. But the example I always give is, when I say, how much is the price for bottled water? And folks are like, it's $1. And then not if you've been in the desert for 3 days, right? So my point is that you think about repositioning your product or service for whom it's most valuable. The other thing is, and obviously that can be tough, because then you want to think about, well, to what extent can customers find alternatives, right? Or how locked in are they into the relationship in terms of sort of their economic or time investment. But I think that you can also think about deepening the relationship, obviously bundling or unbundling, thinking of different incentives, extending the customer service. There are different dimensions that you can play with to try to actually keep the price, i.e. the value, up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're seeing that even with the food delivery services, right? They're offering now sort of flat rate to order as many deliveries as you want in a month.
Yep.
And part of that is sort of convenience. Part of that is also about customer acquisition. So it's really interesting. We've run a little longer than necessarily we planned, but appreciating the conversation. Sid, Mike, do you want to give us kind of a wrap-up thought? What would you, for those folks listening kind of live or recorded, what would you suggest they go do this afternoon or Monday morning to try to prepare for the new normal?
Mike, you want to go ahead?
I would not necessarily just focus on the business and sort of the legacy business. I would let go a little bit of maybe the old paradigm and just really engage in conversations across the board with friends and family, asking them what they think about, or how they're thinking about changing their consumer behaviors, what they will prioritize, what they prioritize now, right? So, I mean, we know that some of these things are already obviously, making an emergence, and then, just kind of writing that down, keeping sort of a think box where you can take notes and throw it in there and revisit it every couple of weeks and say, has this changed? Am I hearing a different conversation out there? Because at the end of the day, I mean, like you said, Paul, it's all about creating a customer, right? So just understanding, how that narrative is changing over time will probably provide a lot of insights.
Cool. Sid?
Yeah. So mine might sound slightly weird, but it ties into what I talked earlier about, view the long game. In times of chaos or crisis, it's phenomenally important to remember the principles that never change. So my suggestion is to start practicing what I call Renaissance time. And Renaissance time is just to read something every day or two that was written before the printing press was invented, something pre-Gutenberg, because if there was something that was written 2,000 years ago and that still exists today, it took human life and sacrifice to keep that idea alive. It's probably worth understanding, as opposed to the Twitter feed, which, nobody wins a Pulitzer Prize for best tweet of the year. So we're looking at, read something written by Marcus Aurelius, or I was reading a historian that had written in 1370 about the bubonic plague, and just understand that life will go on, it will come back, and you can adjust your sails to navigate, whatever troubled waters are happening today. But realize that somebody pulled the rug out today, that is not the end. And just get back up. And maybe it's unsteady, but keep moving. So Renaissance.
I love that, Sid. And here, I'm gonna hold this up. This is an old coin that I have next to my bed. Nice. And it's a from 200 AD, and it's my nightly reminder that we've gone through these things and we will prevail, and that there's going to be good times and times for opportunity again. So I love that, Sid. Thanks.
It sounds like a new podcast, Sid, the kind of Renaissance times, or the pre-Gutenberg files, something like that. But so thank you both. Appreciate you taking the time to share your wisdom and expertise. Our Innovator interview series continues next week. I've got an interview with Patrick Claytor from Big Sky Fulfillment, so be particularly helpful for any businesses out there looking to particularly move kind of more online commerce and sell things. And then Morgan, can you remind me who else we got?
Then we're interviewing Charlie Beaton on how he's making some pivots with Big Dipper, and also how he's navigated the CARES Act. And then Amy McQuilkin, owner of Betty's Divine, and how she's making new pivots to her business model. And how she navigated the CARES Act as well.
Awesome. As we mentioned, all of these interviews are being recorded. They're up on our Facebook page. They're on our Launchpad website. And we actually got a YouTube channel powered by so feel free to hit us up if you can't track those down, but we'll continue to share that information. And certainly the interviews with kind of Molly, actually interviewed last week as well with Kaylee Linder from Moogle Fitness. She told a great story about kind of how her business, which is a fitness business, which typically has been decimated, she's actually thriving in this environment. So there's some great kind of insights from a bunch of folks here. And also Joe Burnich, I interviewed, had some great wisdom on how to sort of build relationships and market yourselves effectively in this environment. So Mike, Sid, thank you so much. Thank you everyone else for attending today.
Thanks,
and
Paul. Thanks,
we'll see you all online again next week.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.